Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum and discuss its recent weekly close below its bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. This has been a long journey. We've been discussing ETH, not only through the lens of ETH USD, but also ETH Bitcoin, Bitcoin dominance, and so on and so forth. So again, if you do like the content, make sure you give the video a thumbs up. So we've been following ETH here for a little while, especially given the breakdown of the ETH Bitcoin pair. Now, before we look at ETH Bitcoin and how it relates to ETH USD, and I'm sure most of you already know what I'm going to say, before we get to that, what we're going to do first is just go back and look at other times where ETH fell below its bull market support band. And we're going to look at several different examples, and then we're going to try to figure out which one is the most fitting to the current example. All right? Because there's a lot of different examples, and some ETH continue to go down, in others it just bounced right back. And so first of all, let's just take inventory on prior examples so that we know what we're looking at here. The last time that ETH fell below its bull market support band was actually about 30 weeks ago. Or the last time it was below the 20-week estimate, 21-week EMA, was about 30 weeks ago. So it's been quite a while. And now we have closed below it once again. The last time we fell below it was August of 2023. We were below the 20-week estimate a little bit before that. But remember, the bull market support band is a range, right? It's not just the 20-week SMA, but it's also the 21-week EMA. And as long as you're above one of them, then you can argue that the asset is still holding its bull market support band. But if it's below both of them, that's where you can definitively say, all right, it has fallen below its bull market support band. And so when you look at this, you can see that the last time this happened was in August of 2023. And when that happened, ETH USD stayed below it for the next 9 weeks. There was another example before that, though, occurred in June of 2023. So kind of a similar time frame as right now, going into the summer. This, of course, occurred about 1 month later than where we currently are. But you can see that we had a weekly close below the bull market support band. If we zoom in, right, a weekly close below the bull market support band right here. And then we just got right back above it the following week. Those are really the only two examples that we've even had in years. Because the examples before that of falling below the bull market support band were essentially way back over here in April of 2022, and before that in December of 2021. So it's actually been quite a long time. Now, there are examples in the last market cycle where we saw ETH USD fall below the bull market support band. There's a great example here in June of 2021 where it fell below it, but then it didn't really go that much lower before running up once again. And so that is also something relevant, and that was also occurred around the same time in the year, right? It fell below the bull market support band in June. And of course, we have to go back and look at the two examples before that, just so we kind of cover our bases throughout all phases of the market cycle. The next occurrence was during the pandemic crash. I don't think we should put too much weight into that example. I don't think we're going to go out and say, all right, well, there has to be a black swan. But the time before that was in July of 2019. And in that case, you can see that it ended up just being a slow bleed back to the downside that lasted for about half a year before we got back into gear. So those are the examples that you can look at, right? You can look at 2019, where after getting below it, we hesitated there for a couple of weeks and then went down. You can look at 2020, where it was just straight below it. Don't really think that's the most realistic example. And then, of course, you can look at 2021 and also late 2021, and see late 2021, it was more or less just a systematic bleed over the next half year, kind of similar to 2019, in fact, right? You get below it in January and it bled till June. 2019, we got below it in July, and then it basically bled until December. So about half a year or so. And so the question is where are we now, right? What can we expect? And again, if you're only looking at its USD valuation, it might lead you to think that it's at different spots than perhaps it actually is. For instance, I think the least compelling option or comparison is the one from 2021. The reason I think that the least compelling option is the one from sort of mid 2021 is because when we were experiencing that sort of a move, remember the ETH Bitcoin pair was in a macro uptrend, right? It was in a macro uptrend. And so ETH kept gaining on Bitcoin. You see that? But right now, ETH Bitcoin, the valuation of ETH against Bitcoin, is in a macro downtrend. And so then it raises the question, well, if we can learn something from ETH Bitcoin and give us insight into ETH USD, when was the last time that ETH Bitcoin was in a macro downtrend, right? That was the question that you would naturally ask, right? When was the last time that ETH Bitcoin was in a macro downtrend? And the last time it occurred was back over here during the last market cycle, where, by the way, we also went through a lot of rate hikes, and we also went through quantitative tightening too, right? So you can see that we had these rate hikes, and while we had the rate hikes, ETH Bitcoin was bleeding. Similar thing over here, right? We've had all these rate hikes, the Fed paused, and ETH Bitcoin was bleeding. Now you'll note back in the last cycle that ETH Bitcoin broke down and bottomed right after the first rate cut. It was after the first rate cut, right? But also you will notice here that ETH USD fell below the bull market support band just before rate cuts arrived. And the reason why that's important is because there's a good chance that the Fed's going to cut sometime this year. I think they might actually cut sometime this summer, even though I know it's not being currently priced into markets. So we will see about that. But if you were to only look at something like this, and to even get a little bit more confluence, add on here total assets held by the Federal Reserve. So if we go to, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing. Let me add on total assets right here. And here again, you can see that ETH USD fell below the bull market support band just before the Fed pivoted to QE. You see that back in 2019? Now, I'm not suggesting that the Fed's going to pivot back to QE immediately. But what I would say is that the Fed did mention that they're thinking, or that they're going to be tapering quantitative tightening starting in June, meaning they're still going to continue to reduce the size of their balance sheet, but they're not going to reduce it as aggressively, okay? So to me, when I look at a chart like this and I say, where is the fairest comparison and what is the least fair comparison? The least fair comparison in the current setup is to say that it's similar to mid-2021. And honestly, that's probably a good thing, right? All things considered, because in mid-2021, while we did go back up, we then saw, massive fallout where tons of projects went bankrupt, right? So, while that you might not like that I'm comparing it to that, ultimately that was a very painful path to go on for both sides, for both the bulls and the bears, because in this case, we went up, made everyone bullish, and then we basically just came all the way back down. So I think that's the least fair comparison, because during that time, QE was still going on, that purple line, rates were basically at zero, and ETH Bitcoin was going up. So I think first of all, we can say, all right, it's not that comparison. That's the least likely. The most likely for me is 2019, because I'm of the opinion that the Fed will likely pivot sometime in the next few months. And so if that's the case, then this is the fairest comparison to the current setup. But that doesn't mean it's the only comparison that we should consider. There does exist, theoretically, a scenario where things keep holding up okay in the economy and the Fed doesn't pivot as soon as I think they will, right? What if the Fed doesn't pivot until next year, like some people are suggesting. If that's the case, then you could argue that what if we are right here in, sort of summer 2023? Interest dies off, ETH USD goes down, maybe it pops back above the bull market support band, but then it just fades back later on in the summer, and we just go nowhere for the next 2 to 3 quarters. That, or the next 1 to 2 quarters. That is a possibility as well. Again, I don't think it's as compelling as the 2019 example, because I actually think that rate cuts are going to likely start occurring this summer. But if I had to say, if you told me, right, if you just said right now, if you're from the future and you told me, hey, Ben, this is not the 2019 comparison, find the next one that applies, I would say, well, if it's not 2019 all over again, it's probably just some type of similar setup as to here, where it gets below it, pops back up for a little bit, and then bleeds back below it later on this summer, and then maybe it picks back up, later on this year. But I still think that 2019 is the fairest comparison, and I think it's because, right, of monetary policy. It has nothing to do with ETH, right? So ETH maxis, get off my back. I actually like Ethereum, right? I mean, you guys can say what you want. I actually like it. But my views about it are not based on whether I like it. My views are just based on, the fact that I think it's going to bleed back to Bitcoin until looser monetary policy arrives. And so I think that this is the fairest comparison, because not only in 2019 was QT going on, not only were interest rates about to be cut, which seems like we're kind of knocking on that door right now, but also just before ETH fell below its bull market support band in 2019, we saw ETH Bitcoin break support, right? Right here. Sorry, I clicked on the wrong one. Right here. You see where it broke support? That's what marks the top on ETH Bitcoin. So ETH Bitcoin broke support. Right after ETH Bitcoin broke support, ETH USD topped, and then shortly after, it fell below the bull market support band. You can see it pretty clearly. Right? Well, I'm looking at the chart. I'm like, all right, what is he smoking, right? But you guys get it. I mean, if you're new, I know this could be definitely confusing. But let me just, this orange line right here, this is interest rates. You can see that the Fed was paused, and then they cut here in July. Just before rate cuts, ETH USD topped out. When ETH USD topped out, it corresponded to ETH Bitcoin, which is this light blue line, breaking below support. You see that? So ETH Bitcoin broke below support, ETH USD topped out, it then fell to the bull market support band, and then shortly after that, rate cuts began. Which is why I don't really think we necessarily have to wait until the end of the year to get the first rate cut. I think that obviously the Fed's talking a big talk right now, but I could see a scenario where they cut sooner than the market is expecting. So to me, this looks like the fairest comparison. Now, you could say, but Ben, they haven't cut yet, right? They haven't actually cut yet. They haven't shifted over to QE. So why do we assume it's 2019? What if it's like March of 2019 and not July? Okay? That's also a fair point, and that's why I said over here, it could be something like this, mid-2023-esque. But that's sort of the second fair comparison, I think. But if I look at it like this, and I don't care, if I don't even know about monetary policy, right? If we just hide that and say, all right, let's forget about monetary policy for a second, just look at it through the lens of ETH Bitcoin. And then you can see a pretty clear picture. ETH Bitcoin durably fell below support right here, which is where ETH USD topped. So this falling below support corresponded to an ETH USD top. It fell below support right here, which corresponded to an ETH USD top. So you can see it pretty clearly that in both cases, ETH Bitcoin broke support and then ETH USD fell. Because then ETH USD has nowhere to hide on its Bitcoin pair, as any move by Bitcoin would likely send the ETH Bitcoin pair even lower. And then people start throwing in the towel on ETH Bitcoin. It goes into outright capitulation this summer. Theoretically, ETH Bitcoin bottoms out sometime later on this summer. And it could be as early as next month. I'm not unsympathetic to that idea. In fact, my base case at this point is that ETH Bitcoin bottoms out sometime this summer, but not ETH USD, ETH Bitcoin. This here if I'm not even looking at the Fed, because again, everyone says, well, it'll do this until the Fed cuts. It's not like that. The Fed reacts to the markets. The market tells the Fed what to do, not the other way around. The Fed's not telling the market what to do. The Fed does not control the animal spirits. The animal spirits will fight back until they just physically can't anymore. It's one of the great things about the markets, right, is that, people don't give up. It's sort of like a reflection of human nature, which is a good thing to some degree, in some cases. Now, in other cases, people lose all their money betting on meme coins, which is not good. But this is a pretty clear example. Now, you might say, but Ben, that's only one example, right? How are you going to take that to the bank? They're not going to cash it in. And that'd be a fair point. But fortunately for us, there's another example. There's a third example where ETH Bitcoin also broke down. And guess what? After it broke down, shortly thereafter, ETH USD fell below its bull market support band. And it actually broke down temporarily back over here in June. You see that first breakdown below that prior support? That marked the top for ETH USD. So don't tell me there's only one example. There's two examples. There's also the 2016 example. And then your response could be, well, that was a bull market. 2016 was a bull market. And also it was a halving year, right? It was a halving year. It was a bull market. And therefore, there's no way it can't be similar to the current time, right? Maybe you would think that 2016 was a bull market, so that's more of a fair comparison as opposed to 2020 or 2019. And I could get on board with that idea, potentially. There's a lot of really smart people that have made the comparison of Bitcoin USD to 2016. I still think it's more similar to 2019, personally, but I'm not completely unsympathetic to the idea of a 2016 comparison. But the problem for ETH is that even if you make the 2016 comparison from when it first took out that wick between the two peaks, right? So peak one here, and then the second peak, that wick, that low. Once it took out that low, that marked the ETH USD top. And from that level, ETH USD still fell 70%, even though you could argue it was a bull market, right? This is one of the reasons I have problems with people that, we call these things bull markets and bear markets. I mean, at the end of the day, if you're gonna witness a 70% drop, who cares what you call it, right? You can call it whatever you want. It's still a 70% drop. And in the grand scheme of things, who cares? Because it still went up a lot after that. And actually, after ETH Bitcoin broke down in 2019, ETH USD fell about 70%, right? And that does not include the pandemic at all. So you can't even say that it's because of the pandemic. That was before that was by December of 2019, before the pandemic crash even happened. If you include the pandemic crash, ETH USD dropped about 75% from that high, from where ETH Bitcoin broke down. So you have two clear examples where ETH Bitcoin broke down, and when it broke down, it marked the local top on ETH USD. After it marked the local top on ETH USD, then ETH USD fell below its bull market support band. And in both cases, after it fell below the bull market support band, ETH USD then fell about another 50%, right? It fell 50% there after going below the bull market support band, and here it also fell about 50% after going below the bull market support band. So while it was a 70% drop from the top, it was 50% from here. Now again, 50% from here puts ETH all the way back down at around 1,400 or so, which coincidentally, as we previously pointed out, corresponds to the lower logarithmic regression trend line, right? A $1,400 ETH would actually get you down there. It would actually, 1,200 is the current fair value, but again, it's a moving target. In 3 months, it'll be higher. In 6 months, it'll be higher, etc. So, and again, I know I put these videos out and everyone's gonna poke fun, but you have to remember that the markets do often repeat themselves with ETH Bitcoin breaking down. And, I can't help but think it's just doing the same thing again. And no one wants to believe it, but I will remind you, the people that are going to be the fiercest deniers of such an outcome have also been very bullish on the ETH Bitcoin pair since the merge, right? It's the same people that said the flippening was going to happen. It's the same people that said that the deflationary tokenomics was a game changer and that the transition to proof of stake was a game changer. My argument is that none of us know the outcome of all that stuff. None of us know about the outcome of proof of stake. None of us know the outcome of the deflationary tokenomics of it because ETH hasn't been given a chance. We still are existing in tighter and tighter monetary policy conditions. So we're only going to find out the success of all that stuff after we go back to QE. But until that time, it doesn't matter. And that's why there's sometimes a disconnect between what feels like should happen based on all the great things happening, but then what actually happens because of monetary policy, right? That's why there's often a disconnect between what it seems like reality should be based on the bullish things that you read and what it actually is because it doesn't really matter how great something is if people can't put food on the table, right? If it doesn't really matter if something's, going to be great in the future if in the short term you're worrying about your job and if you're going to be laid off or not. It's just an artifact of the business cycle. It's nothing related to ETH. And so I want to remind people that, I do like Ethereum. And I say that knowing that even a lot of the people that are really supportive of me right now because of my views on Bitcoin dominance, they're Bitcoin maxis. And so they've actually been very supportive of me for the last 2.5 years because I've been carrying this Bitcoin dominance torch. And they're like, well, yeah, look, he's right. But I'm also here to say, guys, I'm not a maxi. I'm not. I actually do find value in Ethereum. It's just that you're gonna, when you see these tighter and tighter monetary policy conditions, you're just gonna see ETH Bitcoin bleed, and that's what you're witnessing. I mean, ETH Bitcoin is down to 0.047. I don't really think that anything I've said about ETH Bitcoin has been incorrect over the last couple of years. It's been a slow and systematic downtrend, and every single one of these highs was just a lower high. They've all been lower highs, and it hasn't changed. The only thing that has changed is the USD valuation has gone up, but it only went up because Bitcoin lifted it up, not because ETH was doing well or leading the bull market. You could argue that ETH was leading maybe this bull market over here because ETH Bitcoin was going up. But ETH has not been leading this one at all. In fact, the dominance of ETH just put in a new low, or a low that it hasn't even hit since summer of 2022. I mean, it just keeps on going lower. And this is what we've talked about, right? We've talked about this capitulation into the summer of ETH dominance and ETH Bitcoin. And it seems like it's playing out. So when we think about, what is the most likely outcome for ETH USD? We first have to figure out what is the fairest comparison. Is it 2023, right? Is it this, where then it got right back above it? Is it 2021, early 2021? Is it late 2021? I don't think it's this. I don't think it's this. I also don't really think it's this either, or this. I think the fairest comparison is here, is this one. That's what I think the fairest comparison is 2019 after ETH Bitcoin broke down. Or, if you prefer, and again, I can understand why people would prefer the comparison to 2016, but it doesn't matter. If you compare it to 2016, the halving year, or if you compare it to 2019, guess what? ETH USD still dropped 70% from the high, and it still dropped 50% from where it broke below the bull market support band. So if you're in the camp of this is the halving year, it's not the pre-halving year, and you should not compare it to 2019, fine. Compare it to the halving year of 2016 and tell me what happened, right? It still dropped 70%. Maybe that's what happens, right? In both cases, the drop, right? The drop that occurred starting from where ETH Bitcoin broke below its support level for the first time, ETH USD dropped here for 6 months. How long did it drop in 2019 before it started to go back up? Look at that. Exactly 25 weeks. About 6 months or so. Where would 25 weeks put us? If you go out to this top, 25 weeks later, that puts you in September. The reason why September is interesting is because a lot of times September, not always, as I found out last year, But oftentimes, September's not the best month for crypto. Always exceptions to the rule, right? Don't get on my back about it again if September's a green month. But even in 2019, you can see that after about 6 months, it started to go up. You see that? After about 6 months, it really started to move, and then we got a hard landing with a pandemic, a black swan, right? Over here, it was 25 weeks down, and then we just went up into the post-halving year. So I think there's sort of two outcomes here to think about that I think are the most likely. Number one, ETHUSD bleeds off and on until September. That would be a similar outlook as 2016. Halving year, I think it's reasonable to compare it to that as well. Monetary policy, wasn't as, I mean, rates were still low back then, so it's not, I don't think it's necessarily the fairest comparison, but at the same time, who am I to say that it can't be that? Could be. So keep this in mind. After it broke the 20-week SMA, ETHUSD fell 50% in 2016, which was a halving year. So don't tell me it can't do it in a halving year. I watched it do it in 2016. My portfolio, right, has witnessed these drawdowns before, even when I thought that it was impossible. If you think it's 2019, the thing is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's 2016 or 2019. The same thing happened. The only real difference between 2016 and 2019 was that in 2019, just following that, we ended up getting a hard landing. 2016 was a soft landing. Now, I know what you're thinking. 2016, a soft landing. Guys, yes. In 2015 and 2016, there was a lot of discussion back then about a hard landing and a recession. It was very frequently discussed. In fact, I think in some countries, they did have negative GDP, I'm pretty sure. But the US did not. So you have an example where this is what a soft landing looks like. In 2019, that was what a soft landing looked like. And you still had an inverted yield curve back then too. The pandemic showed you what a hard landing looks like. But again, I'm not suggesting that you have to bank on that happening, because it might not. But when I look at this and I say, all right, well, the two fairest comparisons are 2019 and 2016. The next after 2019, if you're not looking at 2016, could be mid-2023, but even then it just popped back above it and then eventually got back below it. In either case, ETH still fell 50% after ETH Bitcoin broke down. And you know where it fell to? It went to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. That's where it went. After ETH Bitcoin broke support. It broke support here. It broke support here. And in both cases, it fell to the lower logarithmic regression trend line. So I don't see a compelling reason why that can't happen again. I really don't. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the short term, which I always regret, because no one can predict the short-term moves in the market. Now, again, you're going to have people that can pretend they can do it, and they will put out bets one way or another, and sometimes they'll be right, sometimes they'll be wrong. But the reality is no one can predict the short-term movement in the market. No one, absolutely no one. I've seen so many people try, and sometimes people go on winning streaks for a while. When someone gets hot, honestly, it's a sign that usually they can, they have a good grasp on what the current trend is, and then they can ride that trend. But inevitably, everyone gets things wrong, including and especially me, okay? So from here, in the short term, I want to talk about you know, potential expectations. Now, if it's going to be a mid-2023, then it means, you know, it could get right back above the bull market support band. Again, I don't really think that's the most likely outcome. You could still see a wick above it, and maybe you get another weekly close just above it, but I do think it's sort of fading here into the summer. If you look at 2019, what you'll see is that it actually did go right back above the bull market support band, but it was only a wick, right? So you had your first weekly close here below it, and then it rallied back up above it, but it was only a wick. The weekly close was still below the 21-week EMA. You see that? But what caused ETH USD to stall out at the bull market support band, and what caused it to go back up right here? It wasn't ETH. It's not like ETH USD was doing anything great at the time. It was just kind of going sideways. Do you see this week right here? July 29th. So what was going on with Bitcoin the week of July 29th? That is the question to ask ourselves of 2019. And the week of July 29th of 2019, Bitcoin had just closed below its 8-week SMA, and then it rallied right back above the 8-week SMA. Bitcoin went up 15%. And in the week that Bitcoin went up 15%, ETH USD went up 5.5%. Do you see what happened? Bitcoin got a bounce while it was still above its bull market support band, right? It was still above it. But ETH USD got pinned below its bull market support band. So it found resistance at a spot that Bitcoin couldn't even find resistance at because Bitcoin was still above it. It was not even at its bull market support band. That's why Bitcoin dominance topped out before Bitcoin fell below its bull market support band. Right? Because the altcoin market had been bled dry against Bitcoin up here. So once alts had been bled dry, then Bitcoin's downturn started. That lasted for about half a year. But it was only after altcoins had been bled dry. Before the altcoin market had been bled dry, Bitcoin was still holding above the 20-week SMA. The reason it held above the 20-week SMA for all those months was because people just kept on converting their alts to Bitcoin. Right? That's what caused Bitcoin to stay elevated longer than ETH and altcoins. So ETH USD went up the following week, but it was only because Bitcoin went up. And during the week of July 29th, ETH Bitcoin fell by 8.5%. Okay, and that was actually just after ETH Bitcoin broke down, which is pretty close to what's kind of going on right now. Now, there's no such thing as a sure thing. There's no guarantee that ETH USD even goes up this week. And if it does go up this week, it's only because Bitcoin probably went up. Unless you get some type of crazy event. You know, if there's some, by some miracle, the spot ETF is approved or something, that could be some type of external event, I suppose, that could at least in the short term, change things up. But still, over a longer period of time, I still see the same trend occurring of ETH bleeding back to Bitcoin until loose monetary policy arrives. So we know that it went up. But then we have to ask ourselves, well, why did Bitcoin go up back then? Was it just because ETH closed below the 20-week SMA? You see this week, ETH closed below the 20-week SMA the week of July 22nd. The week of July 22nd was right here, and then the following week, Bitcoin went up. You see that? So, did it do it just because ETH was below the 20-week SMA? Or was there something else going on? And there were some different things going on. In fact, monetary policy was one of them. If you look at where Bitcoin rallied back up, it actually occurred after the Fed had cut rates. So the Fed cut rates right here, which is precisely when Bitcoin rallied back up. So I don't think Bitcoin rallied back up just because ETH had a weekly close below its 20-week SMA. I think that Bitcoin rallied back up because the Fed cut rates. It still led to a lower high, as we know, but it occurred on the first rate cut. And it was on this rate cut that led to the quick devaluation of the ETH Bitcoin pair. That was where ETH Bitcoin really started to capitulate because it was pinned below its 20-week SMA and Bitcoin was not. Bitcoin is still well above its 20-week, well, maybe not well above it, but it is still above it. In fact, from the current prices, Bitcoin would have to fall almost 9% just to get back to the bull market support band. I do think it will eventually get back down there, right? But it's been a slow process. And if you want to make the 2023 comparison, you could argue that this still looks kind of similar to this, right? But we didn't actually get this big bounce until we had weekly closes at the bull market support band, and we haven't had that yet. So I still think there is a chance here that ETH USD will just simply continue to fade into the summer. Yes, there's going to be some crazy rallies at some point, but my guess is they just lead to lower highs until the last rate cut, or at least some point where monetary policy shifts. And it's the same thing, right? I mean, the people that are going to be the loudest about it now were also very loud back in 2022 when I said, I have a whole video on this stuff, when I said that this was just a secondary distribution phase. And ever since then, it was just a series of lower highs. But every lower high, you had people thinking it wasn't a lower high, and that was sort of the new move that was going to ultimately lead to higher prices. And this just keeps on happening, right? Every single one of these moves, even when I warn about them ahead of time, it still leads to people falling for them and thinking it's different. But it's just been one lower high after another for years. So I don't really anticipate that if you're really bullish on ETH right now, I don't really anticipate that you're going to give my views really any credit or any credence as to being potentially right, because you've already made up your mind. And I do get things wrong, and you could probably point to prior things I've been wrong about to suggest why I could be wrong about this. But there's also been things I've been right about, like Bitcoin dominance, ETH Bitcoin, that sort of stuff. And I think one thing that we could do better as an industry is to not always go after the person, but just kind of like debate the idea. It's easy to go after me as a person if I say something you don't like. Go after the idea, right? If you think I'm wrong, tell me why based on the idea presented. Don't tell me why because of something I got wrong 2 years ago, right? That's not, we all get things wrong. That's not like a fair way to go about it. Say, all right, well, you know, you're saying this about ETH Bitcoin. Maybe you think this time is different because of such reason. I would love to hear that sort of response, right? Tell me why that way. That'd be a much more preferred response than, hey, you were wrong about this thing 2 years ago, therefore you're wrong about this. As if everyone gets things right, which is not true. No one gets everything right. And I mean, even just a couple of months ago, I feel like so many people were calling for 100K before the halving or just after the halving. Again, I'm not saying that stuff can't happen, but I mean, it just goes to show you how quickly the wind can get cut from the sales of Bitcoin after ETH Bitcoin breaks down. And I think a lot of people were not anticipating it because they were just looking at the spot ETF flows and all that stuff. But history shows that when one source of liquidity is taken away, when alts break down against Bitcoin, Bitcoin then falters for a little while. So you can see that ETH USD is below its bull market support band. I'm not calling for it to go down to the lower regression band today or anything. If history is any indication, though, it could make its way there over the next few months, especially going into the sort of the later summer months. I think you could make a compelling case for it to get back down in there. And guys, when you think about it, when you really zoom out, I mean, normally when ETH sets a low, it retests that low at some point. You know, I mean, it's not, I mean, here we didn't quite get down there, but we got pretty close. There's always going to be a reason. So I just don't really understand, you know, why it can't happen again. I mean, if it happened in 2016 in a halving year, if it happened in 2020 in a halving year, why can't it happen in 2024, right? Why not? I mean, the last 2 times that ETH USD tested a prior major low was in the halving year. It was in prior halving years. Why does this time have to be different? You know? And that's the thing. I feel like I've seen a lot of people say, well, Ben's saying that this time is different. I'm not. It's just, I feel like it's just the way you interpret various things. But if you look at it, ETH USD in both 2 prior halving years from the local top where ETH Bitcoin fell below support, ETH USD then dropped 70%. And it bottomed out in the halving year after a 70% drop. So I don't, for me, I'm not saying that this time is different. I'm saying this is the same. It's the same thing. ETH Bitcoin breaks, and then ETH USD falls. But again, I would fully expect the degens to fight me on it every step of the way. And, you know, just like I heard on every single low or high by ETH Bitcoin for the last 2 years as to why my views were wrong, I could easily see the same thing happening on ETH USD, where on every low or high, they say that I'm wrong. And I could be wrong. I could be. I'm trying to find reasons why it could play out differently. At this point, I can't really find any that I wholeheartedly believe in. You know, if the Fed, if something catastrophic happened and the Fed had to turn the money printer on a lot quicker than we're thinking, then maybe it could be avoided. But even in that case, it's the path of the thing that's happening that causes risk assets to drop, which causes the Fed to pivot. So it's just hard to imagine a scenario where something like that doesn't ultimately play out, where it still goes back down and sort of rechecks in. And this is something that often happens in you know, these cycles, is where you sort of set a low, and then at some point in the future you check back in with that low. So I think it's probably going to happen. And I just want people to be aware of it. I know that these views are definitely controversial, but they do not reflect my opinion on the long-term outcome of Ethereum. I do think Ethereum will be successful, regardless of my opinion on short-term price action. I just want people to be prepared for this potential outcome, because I have not always been prepared for it. And it's better to be at least prepared for it. And guys, I'm not even saying like you have to take this information and do anything with your ETH. I mean, if you think it's going to go up, I'm not asking you to, go make a big portfolio decision. But sometimes when you're an investor, it always makes sense to have a little bit of cash, right? Just in case something like this were to play out. Because, the worst thing about investing, especially in crypto, is when you do get crashes and you have no money to put into it. Right? Because then you're very much dependent on it just going back up to bail you out, which often it does, because the Fed bails out everyone over a long enough period of time. But if you have some money sort of set aside in case this outcome occurs, that could be an appropriate response, right? Non-financial advice, right? But that's what I would view as an appropriate financial or an appropriate response to say, well, if it does play out like history, being prepared for it makes sense. If it doesn't play out, then it's not like you can't put that money in something else eventually. There's always something that's, going to go up theoretically. But I just want to make sure that these views are clearly communicated. ETH USD has fallen below its bull market support band, and there is a risk that it could certainly flirt with it here for a couple of weeks, but I do think there's a strong risk that it could fall below. If you look at, or it could keep going down. If you look at 2016, you can see it was staying right above it, and once it got below it, it just went straight down. In 2019, once it got below it, it went back up for a couple of weeks, but it was only because Bitcoin went up. But I think Bitcoin went up because the Fed cut rates, and unfortunately, the Fed's not cutting rates yet. So in the short term, you could certainly see a scenario where Bitcoin just continues to fade back to its bull market support band, which is what it normally does after it breaks below the 8-week SMA. Right, if I pull up let's pull up an 8-week SMA here. So here's the 8-week, and we're gonna go make this a little bit brighter so that we can all see it. Right, so a lot of times after Bitcoin falls below the 8-week, it then goes into the bull market support band, right? Same thing. Sometimes it goes below it, and we're just doing the same thing again. This is a wick. I get it, but a lot of times you'll actually see weekly closes down there. So those are my views on ETH USD. I hope I've done a fair job of explaining them. If you disagree with me, that's fine. I think that's what makes it a market, right? I mean, that's what makes it a market. It's not like we're all going to agree here. But if your biggest comeback is, you've been wrong about something 2 years ago, then I just don't feel like that's a productive way to go about this conversation. I think it's more fair to say, look, guys, I've been saying for a while that when ETH Bitcoin breaks down, ETH USD could then see a larger pullback. And I mean, so far it seems like that's happening, because ETH Bitcoin broke down back in March, and ETH USD is already down, 30%, right? So We'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. See you guys next time. Bye.